The will. It was the last thing my grandparents ever gave me, and it became the first thing my family tried to take. For years, I believed we were close, that our bonds were unbreakable. We shared holidays, birthdays, and Sunday dinners, a perfect portrait of a loving family. But that picture, I would come to find, was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. The truth began to unravel a week after my grandfather's funeral. The air was still thick with grief, and the scent of lilies and sorrow clung to the house. That's when we gathered for the reading of the will. I sat there, my heart heavy with loss, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. My grandmother's lawyer, a stern woman in a black suit, cleared her throat. She read through the usual pleasantries, the small bequests to charities and distant relatives, before she came to the main event. I didn't think much of it at first. My grandparents had always been generous, and I assumed they'd left something small for each of us. But as the lawyer's voice filled the silent room, the words she spoke landed on me with the force of a physical blow. The bulk of their estate, their house, their savings, their collection of vintage cars, everything was left to me, and to me alone. A condition was attached. I had to care for my grandfather's beloved garden for 2 years. A simple request, one I was more than happy to fulfill. The shock in the room was palpable. My aunts and uncles, their faces a mask of disbelief, stared at me as if I were a stranger. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't a silence of respect or surprise. It was the silence of a fuse being lit. In that moment, the loving family I thought I had vanished, replaced by a group of cold, calculating vultures. The lawyer's words had barely faded before the whispers began, and soon after, the accusations. "He's a gold digger," my uncle hissed. "He must have manipulated them," my aunt spat. I looked at their faces, once so familiar, now twisted by a venomous greed I never knew existed within them. Their true colors were finally revealed, all for the price of an inheritance. And for a moment, I was overwhelmed. But that was before I realized that I had a secret of my own. It's strange how, looking back, you can see all the cracks you were too naive to notice at the time. My childhood was split between two worlds. There was the chaotic, often strained world of my own home, and then there was the sanctuary of my grandparents' house. My parents and siblings always seemed to operate on a different frequency than I did. They were loud, boisterous, competitive, each one of them vying for the spotlight, a constant performance of one-upmanship. ABC, my father used to call them, my older brother Alex, the athlete, my older sister Bella, the brain, and my younger sister Chloe, the charmer. And me? I was just me, quiet, observant, more at home with books than with people. My parents always praised them, their achievements broadcasted to anyone who would listen. My own quiet successes, a perfect score on a history exam, a story I wrote that won an award, were met with a polite but brief nod. I never felt like a true part of their team, but more like a perpetual substitute on the bench. But at my grandparents' house, I was the star player. They were the calm to my family's storm. Their home was a place of quiet wisdom and unwavering acceptance. My grandfather, with his laugh lines etched deep into his face, taught me how to garden, his hands gnarled from years of working the soil. He'd show me how to coax life from the earth, telling me that the most beautiful things in life require the most patience. My grandmother, with her soft, kind eyes, would bake with me, her kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and her quiet stories about her life. She taught me to see the world not as a competition, but as a place of wonder and beauty. They saw me for who I was, not for what I could do or how I measured up against my siblings. While my parents were busy pushing Alex towards a scholarship and Bella towards the Ivy League and Chloe towards beauty pageants, my grandparents were teaching me the things that mattered. They gave me their time and their attention without reservation. They were my true north, the only people who ever made me feel completely, utterly seen. My siblings, of course, noticed the favoritism. They called it special treatment, though it was nothing more than love. I'd hear them whisper about it, their voices filled with a bitter jealousy. They'd accuse me of being a teacher's pet, a leech. "Why are you always over there?" Alex would ask, his voice dripping with condescension. Trying to get a bigger cut of the inheritance? Bella would say with a sneer. I'd always shrug it off, telling myself they were just teasing. They couldn't possibly mean it. Not really. I chose to believe they were just being my siblings, their constant needling a twisted form of affection. But their words were like small cuts, 1,000 little paper cuts that sting and then fade, until you look at your hand and see the scars. It was never just a joke. It was a constant, low-level resentment that simmered beneath the surface of our relationships. I saw it in their eyes when my grandmother would give me a special treat she had saved for me. I felt it in their dismissive tones when I talked about my time with my grandparents. They had always been closer to my parents' ambitions for them. They had always been a unit, and I was the odd one out. My grandparents' love was the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't an orphan in my own home. And now, that love, expressed in the most tangible way possible, an inheritance, had turned those small resentments into an inferno. The day of the will reading felt less like a solemn gathering and more like a macabre family reunion. The air in my grandparents' living room was heavy with the unspoken expectation of a payout. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were all there, dressed in their finest black, their faces a mixture of manufactured grief and thinly veiled anticipation. My siblings, Alex, Bella, and Chloe, sat stiffly on a sofa, their eyes darting around the room, already mentally laying claim to the pieces of my grandparents' life they had always coveted. When Mrs. Gable, the lawyer, finally arrived, she was all business. A small, frail woman with a spine of steel, she wasted no time on small talk. She read through the first few paragraphs, the boilerplate language about my grandparents' sound minds and last wishes, and then she got to the bequests. Small, sentimental items were left to distant relatives, a clock to an old friend, a piece of jewelry to a cousin. The atmosphere in the room remained tense but calm, everyone waiting for the big reveal. But the big reveal wasn't what anyone expected. As she read, a gasp escaped my aunt's lips, followed by a ripple of whispers. The family home, a beautiful old Victorian that had been in our family for generations, was left to me. Not to be shared, not to be sold, but to me alone. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. Mrs. Gable continued, her voice unwavering. The savings, the stock portfolio, the vintage car collection, each asset, each dollar, was designated for me. A condition was attached to it all. I was to take care of my grandfather's prized garden for 2 years. This was their final gift, a task I would gladly take on. I sat there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of grief and shock washing over me. I looked at the faces around the room, and the masks of polite sorrow fell away, revealing a twisted tableau of rage and betrayal. My uncle, a man who had always been the loudest voice at family gatherings, was the first to speak. This is a joke, right? You're telling me everything goes to him? The baby of the family, who never did a day's work. His voice was a low growl, laced with a venom I had never heard before. My aunt, her face white with fury, stood up. He must have manipulated them. They were old, they were vulnerable, she shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. Alex, Bella, and Chloe just stared at me, their faces a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated fury. I felt a flash of guilt, a fleeting moment of wanting to make it right, to tell them we could share it, that we could all be a family again. But then I remembered the years of quiet disrespect, the subtle jabs, the feeling of being an outsider in my own family. And I looked at my grandparents' lawyer, this woman who held their final wishes, and I knew that if I caved now, their legacy would be shattered. My grandparents had seen something in me that no one else had, and they had chosen me to carry on their name, their home, and their values. In that moment, the guilt faded, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. The will was their final act of love, and I would not allow their love to be twisted into a weapon of greed. The days that followed the will reading were a blur of coldness and calculated cruelty. The family gatherings that had once been a constant in my life evaporated overnight. Phone calls went unanswered, text messages were left unread, and a silence descended upon my life that was more chilling than any argument. I had been erased, excommunicated by the very people who had once called me family. The silence, however, was just a prelude to the storm. My parents were the first to make their move. My father, a man who had always been more comfortable with silence than confrontation, cornered me in his study. He spoke not of grief or love, but of responsibility. "Your grandparents' money was meant for all of us," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's your duty to share it with your family. We'll set up a trust, and you can just transfer the funds." It's what they would have wanted. I knew he was lying. They would have wanted their wishes respected. My mother, a master of the emotional manipulation, tried a different tactic. She called me, her voice thick with fake tears. "How can you do this to us? To your siblings? You're tearing this family apart over greed. Your grandparents would be so ashamed of you." She didn't have to say the words, but the message was clear. My worth was tied to my willingness to hand over what was rightfully mine. I was a pariah, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had been given a gift they felt they deserved. My siblings, Alex, Bella, and Chloe, formed a united front, a pack of wolves circling their prey. They sent a group text, a digital manifesto of their grievances. Each message was a poisoned arrow, laced with years of pent-up jealousy. Alex, the golden boy, sent a picture of himself in his old high school football uniform. "Remember who we were before you ripped us apart, before you stole everything?" He conveniently forgot that my grandparents had paid for his college tuition and helped him with a down payment on his first car, all things they had done without hesitation. Bella, the intellectual, sent a list of all her academic achievements, followed by a taunt. "I earned my success. You just inherited yours. You're not worthy of their legacy." It was a cruel irony coming from the sister who had always looked down on my love for my grandparents' old, quiet life. And Chloe, the charismatic one, simply sent a picture of our family portrait with me crudely scribbled out, a stark and painful symbol of my new place in the family. I struggled to hold my ground. Every text message, every phone call, every passive-aggressive comment chipped away at my resolve. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell them that their words were the real betrayal. I wanted to remind them of every time my grandparents had helped them, every time they had been kind and generous, only to be met with their cold, calculated indifference. I felt the familiar pang of wanting to be accepted, of wanting to be part of the family again, but I knew that if I gave in, I would be betraying not only my grandparents but myself. My resolve hardened with each passing day. My grandparents didn't just leave me money and a house. They left me a choice. A choice between the loving family they had always been to me and the toxic family that had revealed its true colors. I chose them, and I chose myself. And in that moment, I knew I had to do something more than just hold my ground. I had to fight back. The final confrontation came on a cold Tuesday afternoon. My parents, accompanied by my siblings, arrived at my grandparents' house unannounced, a stack of legal documents in my father's hand. The papers were a meticulously crafted attempt to seize control of the inheritance, a formal request for me to sign over everything to a family trust that they would manage. They stood in the living room, the room where my grandmother had taught me to knit and my grandfather had told me stories, and it felt like they were desecrating the space with their greed. My father spoke first, his voice hard and cold. "We're not leaving until you sign this. This is for the good of the family." My mother stood beside him, her face a mask of disappointment. "Don't make this difficult," she pleaded, but her eyes held a threat. Alex and Bella flanked them, their faces set in grim determination. Chloe stood back, watching the scene unfold, her silence more damning than their words. They had come to break me. I held my ground, the papers clutched in my hand, refusing to even look at them. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "This is what they wanted. You know it." My father's face went crimson with rage. "What we want is what's right. You've always been selfish, always thought you were better than us. But you're not," he roared. Bella stepped forward, her intellectual facade cracking to reveal a raw, bitter fury. "You're nothing without this money. We earned our place in this family. You just got lucky, and now you're going to throw it all away on spite." The final blow came from Alex, the golden boy who always got his way. He grabbed the papers from my hand, his grip tight, and thrust a pen at me. "Sign the damn papers, or you'll regret it." His threat was not just a figure of speech, it was a promise. The family that had once protected me was now threatening me. I stood my ground, my heart pounding against my ribs, refusing to yield. My refusal sent them into a rage. My father's face was contorted with fury as he shouted that I was no longer his son. My mother declared that I was a disgrace. They left the house, not with a sad departure, but with a vicious promise that I was on my own. That night, the phone calls and texts started. My extended family, manipulated by the lies my parents were spreading, began to call me. They accused me of being a cold-hearted miser who had stolen from his own family. The insults and threats were relentless. I was an outcast, a pariah, a villain in a story I never asked to be a part of. My parents, in their final act of cruelty, had cut me off completely. They changed the locks on my childhood home, blocking my access. They had not only stolen my past, but they were now trying to erase my future. I sat in the darkness of my grandparents' empty house, the silence suffocating, the weight of their betrayal a crushing burden. For the first time, I felt truly alone. The walls were closing in, and the despair was a tangible presence in the room. I had lost everything, my family, my past, my sense of security. But in the depths of that darkness, a flicker of light ignited. My grandparents didn't just give me an inheritance, they gave me a weapon to fight back against the people who had hurt them and me. I may have been broken, but I was not defeated. In that moment of absolute despair, I made a vow. I would not just hold my ground, I would make them regret the day they ever underestimated me. My grief and despair transformed into a cold, calculated fury. The inheritance wasn't just a gift, it was a tool, a fortress, and a weapon. My grandparents had given me the means to fight back, and I wasn't going to squander it. I started by doing what I had always done best, observing and planning. I was quiet, methodical, and invisible, and I would use those skills to expose every one of their lies. First, I hired the best lawyer in the city. Not just any lawyer, but a formidable litigator known for handling complex family disputes and white-collar crime. I gave him a simple directive: protect the will and dig into my family's past. I told him every story, every offhand comment, every bit of family gossip I had ever overheard. I explained how my father always seemed to have extra cash, but never a clear reason why, and how my uncle's business went from failing to flourishing overnight after my grandfather's retirement. I gave him the keys to the kingdom of our family's secrets. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica, was relentless. She brought in a team of forensic accountants and private investigators. They started pulling at the threads, and what they found was a tangled web of lies, deceit, and financial impropriety. My father, it turned out, had been siphoning money from my grandfather's old company for years, small amounts at first, and then larger sums, covering his tracks with fraudulent invoices. My uncle, who had always been a bitter rival to my grandfather, had been trying to sabotage his business for decades, even going so far as to steal trade secrets to help his own failing company. The private investigators uncovered a pattern of predatory loans my aunt had pushed on my grandparents, using their trust to convince them to invest in her failing ventures, all of which had been a drain on their savings. My siblings, the so-called innocent bystanders, were not so innocent after all. Alex's athletic scholarship? It was a lie. My parents had paid off a coach at his university to make sure he got a spot on the team. Bella's prestigious academic awards? Also a fabrication. She had plagiarized her award-winning paper, a fact she had paid a professor to cover up. Even Chloe, the charmer, was a fraud. The money my parents had used to fund her beauty pageant ambitions had come directly from my grandparents' savings, not from their own pockets, as they had claimed. They had all been living a lie, built on a foundation of my grandparents' generosity and their own insidious manipulations. The revenge wasn't about lashing out. It was about revealing the truth. I used the money from the inheritance to set legal traps and financial safeguards. My lawyer created a new trust, protected from any legal challenges they might try to mount. She filed injunctions to prevent any of my family from trying to access my grandparents' properties or assets. I was building a wall of steel around the inheritance, a fortress they could not breach. The tension was a constant companion. Every day I waited for the other shoe to drop, for them to find a way to outsmart me, to ruin me. But I had the truth on my side, and with every new piece of evidence, my resolve hardened. This was no longer just about me. It was about honoring my grandparents, about making sure their final wishes were protected, and their legacy was not tainted by the very people who claimed to love them. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of their downfall, and I was just getting started. My family, blinded by their greed and arrogance, was about to make one final, fatal mistake. They had been working in the shadows, crafting a last-ditch effort to ruin me. I received a subpoena for a civil case they had filed against me, claiming that I was mentally unstable and had manipulated my grandparents in their final days. The documents were filled with fabricated stories and false claims, a desperate attempt to paint me as a villain in a story they had written. They had no idea I was one step ahead of them. The court date arrived, and the courtroom was packed. My parents, siblings, aunts, and uncles sat on one side, their faces a mix of righteous indignation and quiet confidence. I sat alone on the other side, a calm eye in the center of their hurricane. When my family's lawyer called me to the stand, they thought they had me cornered. They grilled me with loaded questions, trying to make me seem erratic and ungrateful. They brought up the old lies they had spread about how I was a leech and a manipulator. I answered each question with a cool and collected confidence, and when they were finished, it was my lawyer's turn. Jessica stood up, her presence commanding the room. She didn't ask me any more questions. Instead, she asked the judge if she could present new evidence. A hush fell over the courtroom as she projected a series of documents onto a large screen. The first was a detailed forensic report, exposing the fraudulent invoices my father had used to embezzle from my grandfather's company. The second was a police report detailing the theft of my grandfather's trade secrets by my uncle. The third was a bank statement that showed the massive withdrawals my parents had made from my grandparents' accounts to fund my siblings' fake achievements. The final one was a sworn testimony from the professor Bella had bribed and the coach my parents had paid off. The silence was deafening as each piece of evidence was revealed. The smug confidence on my family's faces crumbled, replaced by a ghastly pallor of shock and disbelief. My mother's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. My father, who had been so full of bluster, was a shrunken figure, his face ashen. Alex, Bella, and Chloe, who had once been so sure of their superiority, now looked like lost, frightened children caught in a lie. Their legal case against me had been completely undermined, and their years of lies were now laid bare for the world to see. The judge dismissed their case, but that was just the beginning of their downfall. The evidence Jessica had presented was more than enough to trigger a full-scale investigation into my family's finances and their deceitful practices. The legal repercussions were swift and brutal. My father was facing charges for embezzlement, my uncle for corporate espionage, and my siblings were being investigated for their roles in the fraud. The very greed that had led them to try to ruin me was now their undoing. I sat in the courtroom, watching them, and felt no joy, only a profound sense of loss. They had sacrificed our family for money, and in the end, they were left with neither. I had been forced to destroy them to save myself and honor my grandparents' wishes. As they were led out of the courtroom, their whispers and accusations replaced by a defeated silence, I stood up, feeling a sense of power I had never known before. I was no longer the quiet kid, the family outcast. I was the keeper of my grandparents' legacy, a guardian of their truth, and the one who had finally made them pay for their sins. In the quiet months that followed, The silence in my grandparents' house was no longer heavy with grief, but with a sense of peaceful solitude. The world had moved on, and so had I. My parents and siblings, once the center of my universe, were now just a distant, painful memory. The money, the legal battles, the revenge, it had all led to this. I was rich in wealth but poor in family, yet I was freer than I had ever been. I walked through the house, touching the things they had left me, my grandmother's old knitting needles, my grandfather's worn gardening gloves, and I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't just about money. It was a final, loving act of a truth my grandparents had always known. They had seen the cracks in my family that I refused to acknowledge, and their will was a final act to protect me from the very people who were supposed to love me. I mourned the family I thought I had, the happy memories of holidays and birthdays now tainted by the betrayal that followed. It's a hollow ache that will likely never fully go away. But I have no regrets. The truth, as painful as it was a far better foundation to build a life on than a lie. My family chose money over loyalty, greed over love, and in the end, they were left with nothing. I learned a brutal lesson. Blood doesn't always mean family. Sometimes, the people who love you most are the ones who aren't even related to you. The question still lingers, and I often wonder what you would have done in my place. Would you have shared the inheritance, or would you have kept it all? Do you think my revenge went too far, or was it a deserved punishment for their betrayal? What would you have done if your own family had turned against you?